All right, Luke chapter 1. Luke is going to open his gospel telling us why he's writing it. Very brief introduction in this book, so we'll jump right into it. Chapter 1, verse 1. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good also to me, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus. Luke's objective here, as he expresses it to us, was to write a narrative. And a narrative is basically an orderly accounting, a story. He's writing us the story of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Storytelling is one of the most effective ways of communicating that we have in our language. If you want to communicate information, the very best way to do it is through story. It's more engaging, it's more compelling, it grabs people's attention better. Storytelling is the best way to communicate. And we're going to see that as we go through this. That's what Luke is doing. He's telling us a story, a very important story. And we typically, as humans, we respond better to stories. When somebody starts telling a story, we tend to engage at a deeper level. Now, everybody's different, of course. I'm a short story kind of guy. My wife, Kelly, likes long stories. When she tells a story, you know, I can usually knock out a story in about 10 or 12 words. When she tells a story, we get all the sounds, we get all the smells, we get all the feels, we get all the emotions, we get it all. We're different, right? But we like stories. Stories can be very, very powerful. Right before Christmas, I had an opportunity to have coffee with a man that I've known for a number of years, Andy Dean, who is the director of the Calvary Chapel Bible College. Really neat guy. And I had known him for a long time, but never actually had a chance to sit down and get to know him. I've taught a couple of times at the college, so I've interacted him with because of that and other events that we've done there. But I had a chance to sit down and just kind of talk with him. And I don't know why. I just said, tell me your story. You know, tell me about who you are. And so he starts telling me the story. And it was very normal, very, kind of vanilla kind of a story until it got to the most pivotal moment in his life. A moment where he was sitting in a coffee shop blocks away from ground zero on September 11th, 2001. He was right there as the planes impacted the Twin Towers. And he went on for 30 minutes. I was mesmerized by this story of how God used him. A man who at that point in his life would admit that he was not looking, he was born in the church, all that stuff, but says, I wasn't looking for God. I was in many ways running away from God. And in that moment, God used him. And then from that moment on, God got a hold of his heart and changed him. It was a powerful story. I've heard lots of stories in my life, but I was mesmerized by this guy's story. So much so, I've been talking to the board. We're talking about trying to get him in here. He's got to tell that story. The church needs to hear that. Radical story. Now we all have stories, right? Would you acknowledge that we all have stories? Now many would say, my story's not that, it's not that radical, not that amazing. It probably isn't. It probably isn't. I mean, those are pretty rare like that. But we all have stories. And here's what I want you to understand. Every story, when it is in the hands of Almighty God, becomes a powerful tool for Him to communicate something to someone. Imagine that. We all have stories. We all have something to say about what God has done in our lives. Luke is going to tell us a story. And it's not just any story. It's the stories of life. It is the story of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, the most important story that has ever been told. Luke tells us in verse 2 that he was not an eyewitness to these things. The things he's writing about, he did not see them. He came in after the fact. He got his information from eyewitnesses, from ministers of the word, he tells us. We know from studies elsewhere that Paul was one of his primary sources, that he joined Paul in one of his missionary journeys. We see that picking up, you can see the evidence of that in Acts chapter 16. We know that he was with Paul during one of his imprisonments, and we also see that he was with Paul at the end of his life. So he spent decades with the Apostle Paul as Paul traveled around Asia and areas of Palestine. In 2 Timothy being the last letter the Apostle Paul wrote, he wrote this at the end, chapter 4, verse 9. Be diligent to come to me, he's speaking to Timothy, quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Luke was with Paul. So wherever Paul went, he went. And every time Paul ran into one of the eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ, Luke was right there with him, getting all this information. So that's where we get the Gospel of Luke from. There's a lot of similarity between this Gospel and the other two, what we refer to as the synoptic Gospels. You know, three Gospels have very similar information they're conveying, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called synoptic because they cover the same basic events, the same basic things, but Luke is unique, and it contains about 30% more information than the other two do. In fact, some information that if it wasn't for Luke, we would be missing some very key events in the life of Christ, including what we just celebrated. The whole Christmas story is found only in Luke. So if we didn't have Luke writing and his gospel, we wouldn't have the nativity scenes and all the things that we've got that we so take for granted. Verse 3 tells us that the gospel was written to a person, which also makes it unique. It was written to Theophilus. Theophilus, his name means lover of God. He's only mentioned here and in Acts 1:1, which is the other book that Luke wrote. One of the reasons I like that is because it was written to a person. The other three Gospels were written to the church. And so there's a personal element or personal feel to it, and that we can relate to it on a personal level as opposed to just a corporate or church level. Theophilus is a Greek name, and so there's a sense that this was written with a Greek mindset. You know, if you're studying, that means something. If you're really getting into the text, that would mean a lot more to you than it probably does to most of us here this morning. But it has a Greek sense to it, whereas the other Gospels were written to different groups, different demographic groups. The phrase "most excellent" in that, and this is a little background stuff, so important stuff, but we're going to get into the story here in a minute. Most excellent refers to probably somebody of some prominence. So this guy, Theophilus, was probably somebody important, and Luke is writing to him.